As round two of head coach interviews commences in Seattle, there's been very little movement with offensive-minded coaches, but that doesn't mean that the Seahawks won't head that direction to replace Pete Carroll. We're going to be looking at some dream pairings of offensive head coaches with defensive coordinators on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on our Wednesday episode by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening in Ellensburg, Washington, or Portland, Maine. We appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. As the Seahawks continue to commence interviews seeking a replacement for Pete Carroll, we are going to be taking a look at some of his former assistants around the league, where they may be landing, which teams are looking at them, and which former assistants could be nice to bring back with the new coaching staff. Plus, we've got report cards for running backs. We'll be in the backfield talking Ken Walker, the third Zach Charbonnet and company, in a jam-packed episode brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. On yesterday's show, we took a look at all of the defensive-minded head coaching candidates that the Seahawks have been linked to for second interviews. 4 of the 5 reported interviews are defensive-oriented coaches. And so that's made it look like the Seahawks are zeroing in on that side of the football for their next coach. But Rob, you and I have talked about it throughout this process. That doesn't mean they are not going to hire an offensive coach or one of the ones they interviewed in the first wave that might not have a second interview. Maybe was so impressive they didn't feel like they needed a second interview. There's always some secrecy to these things. So keeping that in mind, flipping the script from yesterday, we looked at defensive-oriented head coaches with a dream pairing offensive coordinator-wise. We are going to switch things up today with offensive head coaches and a perfect pairing with a defensive coordinator. And I'm going to give you the mic first, as always, good sir. What is the first combo of offensive head coach and defensive coordinator that you would like to see in Seattle?
Well, I appreciate that, Corbin. And I've already kind of championed Frank Smith, the offensive coordinator with the Miami Dolphins here. But so I'm going to switch over to a man that at least has been reported as being the only offensive mind that the Seahawks have brought in for that second interview, and that being Mike Kafka, currently the offensive coordinator of the New York Giants. And so I think if you're going to go with a player with a mind like a Mike Kafka, who does not have that head coaching experience, then I think that you have to go with a defensive coordinator who has a great deal of experience. And I'll actually just stick in the same NFC East division in which Mike Kafka has, kind of risen up here recently, again, of the New York Giants. And let me just for a moment kind of mention Kafka's, the reasons why he is being celebrated here. I mean, you look at what the New York Giants did and the fact that they had the injuries that they had at the quarterback position, at the running back position, the turnover at the offensive line, and yet the Giants still were a successful offense. That's why Kafka is being interviewed by basically everybody. But I'm going to go with Ron Rivera here, formerly of the Washington Commanders, formerly of the Los Angeles Chargers. I mean, he's basically been everywhere. He's a former head coach, formerly the Carolina Panthers. And it's because of that experience, Corbin, is why I think that he would be a nice mix with a guy who I am excited about his future in Mike Kafka, but at the same time, I want a little bit more stability. And so that's why I'm going to go with Ron Rivera here. I know that he is not somebody that is necessarily going to excite a lot of Seahawk fans, but what I can promise you is that if Ron Rivera is your defensive coordinator, then you are going to have a physical and assignment sound defense. I think that he is one of the better defensive minds in all of the NFL. If those of you who love the idea of a Mike Vrabel, I think you also should love what Ron Rivera provide as a former linebacker himself. Again, his teams have always followed his lead in terms of being physical, being, again, assignment sound. I really think that he would be a nice pairing, his experience with Mike Kafka's upside. If the Seahawks are going to go with an offensive-minded head coach, I do think, especially when he doesn't have a lot of head coaching experience, I do think that they need to have a little bit more experience on the defensive side of the ball.
You and I are thinking in the same vein here with our first pairings here. A first-time offensive head coach and a defensive coordinator who has been through a bunch of seasons, has had a lot of success in the NFL. And Ron Rivera is one of those coaches that I could see if he goes back down to being a defensive coordinator, he's going to have a lot better defenses than he did as a head coach because you're wearing so many hats. When you're a coordinator, your job solely get that defense ready to play on Sunday, and he has been really good at that in the past. Another guy that's been really good at that in the past, and he sat out this year, Leslie Frazier. I think the Buffalo Bills missed him immensely this season, and they were still able to make a decent playoff run. But Leslie Frazier, in my opinion, is one of the top defensive minds in the entire NFL. He's been around the block. He had a brief stint as a head coach with the Minnesota Vikings. He has been an established defensive coordinator that's had a lot of success in this league with multiple teams. That would be the kind of person that I would want to put with a first-time head coach like Frank Smith. And I know that the Dolphins offensive coordinator has not been linked to the Seahawks for a second interview. But again, I will remind all of our listeners, there have been plenty of times where coaches have not gotten second interviews and they turned around and got the job because they were so impressive the first time. And a lot of it has to do with secrecy. Front offices don't want people realizing, oh, we really are interested in this guy. So I'm not saying this is any sourcing that he is still in the mix here, but I wouldn't be surprised that Frank Smith is still very much in the mix. So I think you get a guy like that that's got the offensive line, run game background that Frank Smith brings, the leadership, the coaching ability, the teacher ability, and you put him with a guy that's very similar demeanor on the defensive side of the football. Leslie Frazier has always been a popular coach for players. So if you're looking to keep the culture with a coordinator too, I think Leslie Frazier would be a really nice pick to pair with a first-time head coach like Frank Smith.
No, I 100% agree with you. I really like that pairing. I think anything involving Frank Smith, I definitely am in favor of it. If the Seahawks were going to go in a different way, if they want to go with, say, a Bobby Slowick, who, of course, is the offensive coordinator of the Houston Texans, deserves an awful lot of credit for all of the success on offense that the Houston Texans, led by C.J. Stroud, the quarterback position, the wide receiver, Tank Dell is one of the rookies, Nico Collins as well, had a breakout season. The head coach there, D'Amico Ryans, of course, is a defensive-minded guy. So if you want to give some credit to the success on offense for the Houston Texans, then you really have to give credit to the 36-year-old offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick. Again, if the Seahawks are going to go with that kind of mentality and just go with a very, very young head coach with the offensive personality, then I think that you have to have a defensive coordinator who has some experience. And Brandon Staley has that experience. He was a defensive coordinator previously, had a great deal of experience with the LA Rams, so he's going to have the divisional familiarity that you're looking for. And then, of course, he was the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers, and I think that that's important as well. Again, he's a young coach. He's 42 years old, relatively young man, but still he has that head coaching experience. So that's, going to be the theme for me, Corbin, is that of the offensive coordinators or offensive coaches that the Seahawks have been linked to, they don't have a great deal of head coaching experience. I want that head coaching experience on the defensive side of the ball to kind of counter that youthful enthusiasm but lack of experience that they might be bringing on the offensive side of the ball.
We've just talked about 3 first-time head coaches with veteran established defensive minds as the coordinator. I'm going to pivot for this last one. And honestly, I think this might be the pairing that has the most upside, but you do have that dearth of experience from a head coaching standpoint. Ben Johnson, the rising offensive guru that is leading the Lions offense, and Patrick Graham, who's been getting head coach interviews. He's had 2 interviews now with the Seattle Seahawks. And we have talked the last few days about Patrick Graham's impact on the Raiders defense and how well they played in the last 9 games after Josh McDaniels was fired. He is popular in the locker room. Players love his mind, his football acumen. I would love to see this pairing from the sense that even though Patrick Graham has not been a head coach, he has been an assistant head coach previously. So he's had some of those responsibilities that he's shared, and he's been a defensive coordinator for multiple teams. He's been in Bill Belichick's system. He's been with the Giants. He's been with the Dolphins. He's been with a lot of different coaches, and he's had success everywhere that he's been. So you're still going to have that experienced asset that Ben Johnson, as a first-time head coach, can lean on while he is managing the offense, because that's what he's going to want to do. He's going to want to be the play caller, and he's probably the most intriguing offensive mind in this entire group. So there would be some, without having a veteran that has been a head coach on the staff on defense. At the same time, I think there might be the most upside here with 2 guys who are near the top of my list in head coaching candidates. If you could get Patrick Graham to come over to Seattle as the defensive coordinator with an assistant head coaching tag, I would really love that pairing with those 2. Speaking of assistant coaches, coming up next, the Seahawks have a bunch of former coaches on Pete Carroll's staff that are taking a look at other jobs around the league. One of them has already accepted a job elsewhere. We're going to be looking at what's new with Shane Waldron and company and which former assistants we'd like to see come back with the new coaching staff. Don't go away. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in North America. And it's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you versus the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. PrizePicks is so easy to play. I can submit my entries in less than 60 seconds. And now that we're in the heat of the basketball season, the playoffs are here in the NFL, you can still do combo projections in the Specials League. For example, you can have one of the top receivers in this championship weekend. If Deebo Samuel's healthy, for example, teaming up with Steph Curry for 11.5 3-pointers plus receptions. PrizePicks even offers a reboot policy, so your entries stay in play even if one of them unfortunately gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the first half and doesn't return for the second half, that player is rebooted. And PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform that offers such an injury insurance policy. PrizePicks is an absolute blast to play each week, and it's an easy way to enjoy fantasy without the hassle. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Following the news that Pete Carroll would no longer be the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, reports quickly surfaced that Seattle was going to allow all of Carroll's former assistants from this last season to explore other opportunities. And we are already seeing that happen here in recent weeks. Rob, the biggest news coming officially this morning: Shane Waldron is becoming the offensive coordinator for the Chicago Bears. We don't know who the quarterback is going to be, whether it's Justin Fields or Caleb Williams, but he is going to have an intriguing quarterback situation he's going to be dealing with in Chicago. And with that, it sounds like a couple of the other assistants under Pete Carroll on the offensive side of the football could be joining him in the Windy City.
Yeah, they absolutely could be. And I think that's what's fascinating here is that we've been talking so much, Corbin, about all of these different coordinators, all of these different head coaching candidates. Should the Seahawks be looking internally? Should they just be promoting one of their own former coordinators or perhaps a positional coach? Chad Morton has been the running back coach going back with Pete Carroll. I remember when Chad Morton was a running back for Pete Carroll's USC Trojans back in the day. And so there's a good possibility possibility. At least he has been linked to the Chicago Bears and might be following Shane Waldron there. Andy Dickerson, the offensive line coach that we've talked so much about before, he has had a great deal of interest from NFL clubs, in not only in terms of being an offensive line coach for them, but possibly an offensive coordinator, including with the Cincinnati Bengals, for example. The wide receiver coach, Sanjay Lal, has also created some buzz for himself. So again, to me, this is one of the conversations I think that we have to be having here is, should John Schneider be looking at some of the men who have been coaching the players, have that familiarity, and perhaps bringing them in rather than going outside of the franchise to bring these guys in. So to me, that's an interesting conversation here. I do think that when it's all said and done, the Seahawks are going to be moving elsewhere. All these coaches, of course, had their ties to Pete Carroll. And I think that there is going to be a clean break here. I think that's what it feels like the Seahawks are looking to do. But, real quickly, jumping ahead, I mean, as far as some of the coaches that I would like to see the Seahawks bring back, I do think that Dickerson is one that makes an awful lot of sense. I think that Larry Izzo, the special teams coach, makes an awful lot of sense to try to bring back. I would like to see the pass rush specialist coach. I think BT Jordan come back as well. I mean, there are some interesting names out there. I think the Seahawks would be wise to consider bringing them back based on the production that we saw and what they were able to do this past season with the Seahawks.
Normally in the NFL, when we see a team change head coaches, whoever gets hired is going to bring in their entire own staff. And so you don't normally see a lot of carryover, but there have been exceptions. There are coaches that end up staying put with new head coaches coming in. And trying to remember which team it was, but the longest tenured coach in the NFL, a special teams coach, is now going on 22 seasons with the same team, and they've had at least 5 head coaches during that span. So there are examples of coaches that end up staying put when there's a head coaching change. I don't know that any of these former Seahawks assistants are going to have that type of path here. A lot of it depends on who gets hired. Now, I'll say this, if Dan Quinn gets the job, or if somehow Dave Canales re-enters the picture and he gets the job, if somebody that is from Pete Carroll's coaching tree, or at least has been on his staff before, gets hired, then I could see a handful of these guys being brought back as part of your coaching staff. If you have a newcomer like a Ben Johnson who's never been a head coach before, in a situation like that, he might want to have a few guys on the staff that have been coaching in Seattle that know the culture. The thing that'll be interesting if it's a coach out there that has been a head coach before, like say a Raheem Morris, but doesn't have the connection to Seattle that say Dan Quinn does he bring back any of these coaches? Is there going to be any reason for him to do that? So I really think it depends on the hire, but going off what you said and looking at the list here, again, this isn't every single one of Seattle's assistants that we've got up on YouTube, but these are the notable ones. I agree with you on Andy Dickerson. I don't think he's going to be back in Seattle, but all the injuries they had in the offensive line, and yet they still found a way to put together at least a competent group most of the season. There were certainly some issues. There were some limitations from that O-line, but I'm not pinning that on Andy Dickerson. They had so many health issues up there, and clearly other teams value him. The Bengals and the Browns have both given him offensive coordinator interviews up to this point, and there are other teams that have been sniffing around. So certainly he'd be high on my list. Larry Izzo as well. But I'm with you on BT Jordan. He is the one coach here. He was only on the staff 1 year. He coached at Michigan State before then. He's fairly new in the coaching profession, being with teams like this. If I was an incoming coach and I saw what happened with Boye Mafe and some of these other rushers for the Seahawks, their interior production as well, I'm trying to get him back on my staff, and I'm having a pass rushing coach because I think it did pay major dividends for the Seattle Seahawks. Him and Larry Izzo would probably be the two guys on that list that I think are the best chance to come back, because Larry Izzo is a widely respected special teams guy. He was a great special teams player in the NFL. We're talking an all-pro, Pro Bowl caliber special teams player for more than a decade, and he loves the Pacific Northwest. He's really enjoyed coaching here. So if you bring a new coach in and they're looking for a special teams mind, you can have carryover there. And I think that BT Jordan coming back would make a lot of sense as well.
No, he absolutely would. You just mentioned, I mean, Boye Mafe, I think to me is basically the resume that the BT Jordan has to show in terms of the Seahawks specifically. From going from an ultra raw, sushi raw type of a player that Boye Mafe was 2 years ago to, of course, leading the Seahawks in sacks and that seven games in a row performance in which he had. Again, I think it kind of speaks for itself and why whoever the head coach might be in the future, even if he does have a defensive background, I think that he is going to have to look at BT Jordan and perhaps Clint Hurtt, perhaps some of the other coaches on the Seattle's defensive side. But I think that the conversation has to start with Jordan.
Yeah, I think the offensive coaches are probably the ones that offer the most intrigue league-wide. Somebody like Carl Scott could be on the radar because I think he's a very football-savvy coach. I liked what he did with a lot of the DBs in Seattle, but that might be a position where he's better off going elsewhere at this point. And again, it depends on coaches. Maybe Dan Quinn loves Carl Scott and keeps him on the staff. We just don't know yet at this point. It depends on who gets that coaching job, whether or not we're going to see any of these guys come back. But one thing we do know, Shane Waldron's going to Chicago, and it looks like he's going to be bringing a few of the other assistants most likely with him to the Windy City. And oh, by the way, the Seahawks play the Bears in Chicago this year, so they are going to get to play against Shane Waldron and likely several other assistants. That'll be a game to circle on the calendar for those reasons, and potentially a Bears team that's going to have a lot of intrigue with a new rookie quarterback with a number 1 overall selection. Up next, we're going to continue our final report card series. We're going to go to the backfield, running back time, Ken Walker III and company. We're going to look at what went right, what went wrong, and hand out final grades for Seattle's top 3 backs. Don't go away. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whether it's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number 1 ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the most valuable player and bring home the win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are listening in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Make sure to check out Locked On's first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. Yesterday, we talked defensive tackles, the big and heavies on the defensive line. We're going to look at the flashy skill players out of the backfield today in our final report card series. The running back position, if you look at raw stats, Rob, certainly it was not the season that Pete Carroll and the Seahawks were envisioning. I think they thought this was going to be a much improved rushing attack, and yet they finished 28th in the NFL in rushing yards, and much of the season, it just felt like they couldn't quite get over the hump. There were flashes where the run game would be brilliant, especially the players back there, your Ken Walker III, Zach Charbonnet combination. They had some really good games this year, but the problem was they couldn't find consistency, and there were too many games where Shane Waldron got away from the run game. Sometimes the way the game was flowing ended up making it they couldn't run the football. And so ultimately the final stats overall don't look great. At the same time, if you were watching the film closely and you saw what these running backs were able to do with all of the O-line injuries in front of them, especially all of the broken tackles, that might be the most impressive thing that these running backs accomplished this season.
Oh, no question. For Kenneth Walker III, it was the most impressive thing that he accomplished was breaking tackles and making something out of nothing. There's an old expression out there, trying to make chicken salad out of chicken something. And that's what I felt like Kenneth Walker III did an incredible job at times this season. He was the offensive rookie of the year, or at least the runner up this past season, 2 years ago, of course. And he broke that 1,000-yard threshold, had 9 touchdowns. I think that we all expected that would be kind of the ascent point. That was going to be what you thought that he would start off getting, is at least 1,000 yards, at least 9 rushing touchdowns. To see those numbers drop in 2023, even with another second round selection dedicated to Zach Charbonnet, of course, I still think that it left a lot of us just wanting more out of the running back position. And as you said, I mean, I don't know that Kenneth Walker III deserves the blame for that. I think there's a whole bunch of different factors here that contributed to it. But the reality is that he basically averaged the same amount of yards per carry this past season and wound up with 905 yards and 8 rushing touchdowns. Again, a year before that, he was at 1050 and 9. And so to see him go down despite starting 15 games after only starting 11 games the year before, I think is disappointing. But at the same time, my goodness, I gave the offensive player of the year, the MVP on offense for the Seahawks, in my opinion, was the wide receiver DK Metcalf. But was there anybody on Seattle's offense, including the quarterback position, that made your jaw drop and just appreciation of athletic ability more than K9 this past season? To me, he is among the most dynamic players on in all of the NFL at the running back position, and one of the biggest reasons why I do think that this is a head coach and an offensive coordinator position that for the Seahawks, that a lot of coaches out there should be kind of frothing at the mouth to be able to try to help a player like K9 really take advantage of his skill set.
Illustrating his proficiency in turning nothing into something. We saw this a lot in his rookie season, but this year he was in the top 5 with 56 forced missed tackles, according to Pro Football Focus. So some of that also tells you the offensive line is not doing a good enough job creating running room, but at the same time, that is a ton of missed tackles, almost 3 yards per carry after contact this year, with that offensive line dealing with all the injuries they had in front of him. And I think the other thing that's exciting about this running back group is even with the O-line injuries, there were still plenty of explosives. Ken Walker III was 11th in breakaway percentage on designed runs of 15 or more yards. He was 11th in percentage for breakaway rate. And Zach Charbonnet, in his limited action, had 17 runs of 10 yards or more. That was maybe the biggest surprise. I mean, we knew he was a really good athlete, and he had a lot of chunk plays at UCLA, but I was wondering if that was necessarily going to translate to the next level. He was just as explosive most of the season as what Ken Walker III was, and he was a little different doing it because he's more of a between the tackles runner, a downhill runner, but he showed that burst and speed to be able to pick up big chunks of yardage and had almost as many runs of 10-plus yards as Walker did on significantly fewer carries. So the explosives were there, the missed tackles, the yards after contact. The numbers might not have been quite as good for Ken Walker III this year because he didn't get as many carries, and the run game just wasn't leaned on as much. There was too many games where they got away from it early, and they weren't able to establish that rushing attack the way they wanted to. But you saw both these guys live up to the talent of second-round picks. They just need to be put in a better position where they can really maximize their skill sets. And the other thing that's worth noting, you got good receiving numbers from your backs, Charbonnet and Walker in particular, and special teams. DJ Dallas got all pro votes as a return man. And I know some 12s out there have kind of mocked that, but he was in the top 7 in punt return yards per punt, and he was in the top 6 in kick return yards per kick. He also had a bunch of tackles on special teams. So you can say what you want. He was one of their best special teams players, and he was one of the more effective kick and punt returners in the NFL, at least statistically. And you saw some times where he was able to break tackles and pick up some big yardage, particularly on punt returns. So I think the special teams stuff also fits in. It's unfortunate that we can't be talking more about the talent in this group because there just wasn't enough plays. And Pete Carroll talked about that all year, and that might be one of the reasons Pete Carroll's no longer the head coach. This was an issue they could not figure out how to get that run game more involved consistently with the offense. And I think that that's part of the reason they had the time of possession discrepancy they did, along with the defensive struggles.
Yeah, again, I 100% agree with you there. And I'll kind of go back to one of the things you were saying before about with, like, say, DJ Dallas, and the fact that there are some Seahawks fans out there, I guess, who are scoffing at the all pro votes. One of the things I've always appreciated about DJ Dallas, besides the fact that I think he is truly one of those glue guys, one of the leaders on this team, is he's a screw around. He's running north and south. And that is one of the things that I do have some concerns about, say, Kenneth Walker III. I thought that he improved this past season from his rookie year, but there still was an awful lot of east to west trying to stretch plays and make them a little bit bigger. There's a reason why there have been some comparisons to a Barry Sanders or a Gale Sayers, who were absolutely dynamic, but sometimes they're better in a video game setting than they are in real life football. DJ Dallas hits the hole, gets what he can get, is going to keep grinding his legs to try to get those extra yards. But at the same time, he also recognizes when the play is basically dead. And so that, to me, is one of the things that he did a great job of. Zach Charbonnet did a great job of. I do think that the Seahawks, again, have one of the great running back trios, maybe even foursomes in all of the NFL, because unfortunately, the Seahawks never got really an opportunity to see what Kenny McIntosh could do. And he is one of the backs I'm most excited about, but here we are at the end of the season, not having a single conversation about a single carry that Kenny McIntosh was able to have. So that, to me, is one of the things that was so disappointing about the 2023 Seattle Seahawks campaign. Is it felt like you had an extra player, extra little juice that you never even got an opportunity to taste. And so that's, to me, is going to be one of the real challenges for whoever is the head coach, offensive coordinator, running back coach that is going to be joining this club moving forward, is how do you get all four of these backs, who of course are all, expected to return next season. Certainly the drafted players of Charbonnet, of Kenneth Walker, and Kenny McIntosh are expected to come back. And how do you get them all on the field and take full advantage of their talents?
Yeah, DJ Dallas being the only one that's not under contract, and I could see with his special teams assets that they could maybe bring him back on an inexpensive one-year deal. That would be the reason they would keep a veteran running back around, is the special teams aspect. Maybe they decide to move on, though, with a new coaching staff. We don't know, but I'm with you. The biggest disappointment for me was not being able to see McIntosh, because we saw him early in training camp, Rob. We got to see how he looked out there, and he was one of the most impressive rookies on the field. And then he got hurt in the mock game, missed most of the first half of the season, and then only got a handful of special team snaps. No offensive snaps this year, not just carries, no offensive snaps. So I'm hoping that the former Georgia standout will get his opportunity to get into that rotation this upcoming season. As far as grades go, this one was pretty self-explanatory for me. I thought Ken Walker III had a strong season, not quite as good as last year, as you mentioned. It's not just statistically, not all on him, but a solid 85.5. Charbonnet an 80, just because the explosives, the broken tackles. There were still a lot of things that I liked from his game. The pass protection wasn't quite as good as I thought it was going to be. There were more drops in receiving than I thought, but running was good. So an 80. And then DJ Dallas only got a handful of touches in the receiving and running game this year. Can't really evaluate him much for that. When he was out there, didn't get much done this season in very limited opportunities, but his grade stays around a C because he was a solid special teams contributor and did get a few all-pro votes for his work as a kick and punt returner this year. Overall, considering circumstances, I still think this was a position of strength. Unfortunately, they really couldn't maximize this group because of the offensive line injuries and being allergic to running the football too much at times, if we're being brutally honest.
Yeah. No, it's allergic to running the football is a beautiful way of putting it, because that's what it felt like. It felt like there was, just a bad taste in Shane Waldron's mouth every time that he had to run the football. It just became so damn predictable. I mean, they mentioned it on some of the telecasts that the Seahawks were among the teams that ran the ball the most on second and long. And that just seems like one of the most unlikely positions in which to run the ball and actually have any type of success. So, we mentioned earlier in the show, the Chicago Bears are going to be having Shane Waldron as their offensive coordinator. Hey, good luck to you, Chicago Bears. We'll see what happens. Dolphins. But I do think that whoever, again, is calling the plays for the Seahawks moving forward, I hope that they take advantage of the very gifted skills that they have at the running back position moving forward.
As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, going to be taking a look at a potential dark horse offensive coordinator candidate that formerly was in the NFC West, and more updates on the head coaching search as well. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.